Good afternoon to those of you joining us from the East Coast or Central Time. And I guess good morning to those on the West Coast or maybe elsewhere in the world. We will start up the webinar here in a couple of minutes. Just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. I know lapsed donors are a topic that probably most of us think most about towards the end of the calendar year. And it's good to be thinking about them here together in the spring and considering what we can do to help bring back our lapsed donors. So I'll give it another minute or so here to let folks join in. I see we've got a good number already, and then I'll introduce my colleague Elizabeth and we will go from there. So my name is Matt Gerken. I'm a partner here at American Philanthropic out of our Chicago office. And I'm joined today by the real brains behind a lot of the data work that we do at American Philanthropic, Elizabeth Tokars, who is joining us from not far away, although a different time zone from Chicago. She is in South Bend, Indiana, glorious South Bend, where I hope, like Chicago today, there's finally, the perma gray of Midwest winter is subsiding at least a little bit. But Elizabeth and I worked on the study we're going to be reviewing today last year to answer and tackle kind of a number of questions about lapsed donors. This is a topic I've been interested in for a number of years, and at least when I was trying to look into kind of the literature of lapsed donors, there wasn't a whole lot out there. There's some interesting studies that date back 15, 20, 25 years or so now at this point. So we decided to launch our own. And we worked with a number of nonprofits here to survey over 4,000 lapsed donors in total to learn their opinions about the nonprofits they had been donating to and try to figure out their other habits so that we can make sure our advice and our tactics and strategies that we have for reaching lapsed donors are things that are going to work. So we'll dig into that, some of that data now. So as we all know, as fundraising folks, one of the things that we know about our donors is they will stop giving, and they will stop giving at very high rates in many instances. When we at American Philanthropic work with many different types of nonprofits, sometimes we'll see relatively high rates of retention of donors, particularly for smaller organizations that have smaller lists of donors. And then sort of paradoxically, sometimes we find larger organizations who have much larger acquisition campaigns, for example, often have lower rates of retention. The averages we see, depending on the size of the nonprofit, tend to be kind of in the 40, 50, 60% overall year-over-year retention range. And as we all know, for first-time donors, those numbers are often quite miserable. In fact, 15%, 20, 25% retention rate of first-time donors. So because we know that pure donor acquisition is very expensive, we want to make sure that we're investing the time and thought and resources and strategies into reaching those lapsed donors who are often an audience that's more likely to get back on that active donor list than a pure prospect. So when we talk about lapsed donor strategies, a lot of organizations will perform some very basic things. They'll include lapsed donor lists, for example, on direct mail or email acquisition campaigns. Some organizations tend to try to reactivate donors using match campaigns. If you come back to donate to us, we have a donor who will match that gift or who will give an additional gift for the number of donors that come back on board. Occasionally, if you have a large, your university with a call center, or you have a telethon effort at some point during the year, some lapsed donors are often included in those. And occasionally you'll see, when you hire a new major gifts officer and they may not have a totally full caseload from the beginning, some higher level lapsed donors might be included with those. Now, those are all good strategies. There's nothing wrong with them. But we often find when we think about this category of development activity, there's a a lack of knowledge about why your donors might have stopped giving, if they've chosen to do that of their kind of their own reasons, their own volition, or if there were things that maybe a previous era, your development department had dropped the ball on and caused that. And so one of the reasons we wanted to do this survey was to verify some assumptions we might often make about who lapsed donors are and why they stopped giving. Starting with one of the most important questions, I think, which is, do they even consider themselves lapsed donors or someone who's ceased to be a donor in some way? But to step back for a second and talk about why you should be surveying your donors overall, and I don't just mean lapsed donors here, I mean all types of donors. Surveys are a really important cultivation tool that we recommend to anyone who can make time in their development calendar to do these sorts of things. And we help our clients do surveys really for three key purposes, I would say. One is purely that it is an act of cultivation. So I don't know how all of you think about surveys. I hate surveys. I don't want to take surveys, right? I don't enjoy giving my opinion to a screen that's going to collate my information with hundreds of others. I hate it. I hate when I go to the grocery store and then you get a survey afterwards about whether the tomatoes were good or whatever. It's not fun, right? But a lot of people aren't like you. That's if there's one key psychology lesson in fundraising, I think, is your donors are not you. They have different sets of preferences, different behaviors, different reasons for giving, different reasons for doing the things they do. And surveys are one way that we find a lot of donors really love taking surveys and expressing their opinions. And part of the reasoning for that is that if you think about your mid-level donors and your lower-level donors, they are not frequently given opportunities to provide any sort of opinion or feedback about your organization. They are often, purely passive recipients, right, of solicitations, cultivation pieces, thank you notes, all those things that you hope will reach them. But if they're not getting, lunch with a major gifts officer the way your higher level donors are, they have no way to give you any sort of feedback and interact with you on that level. So surveys are a very important cultivation tool for that audience. The second reason is that as we're doing with this survey, we want to make sure that we're verifying assumptions we might be making about our donor base and what they think about particular issues or items related to our mission. And there are really things that we have to admit we don't know about them, right? Whether that's something in the news that affects your mission, whether that's assumptions you're making about demographic information that you don't have in front of you. Are your donors on average, are they married? What is their ages? All those sorts of things. And so the second purpose is really that kind of more social scientific. There are really things I really want to know, or I want to know where they prioritize different aspects or different programs that my nonprofit offers. And then the third reason is that surveys are an important lead generation tool. We can ask donors about their gifts to other organizations, whether they're giving to other organizations that have a similar mission, whether they might be giving larger amounts to other organizations, and crucially, whether they might have left or nonprofit in their will, whether that's your nonprofit that you're surveying them from, or whether that's other groups that they give to. And we had some of those questions here in our survey on lapsed donors. We'll get to those results in a second. So it's very important to survey your donors. Now, with this lapsed donor survey, of course, we're not going to refer to them as lapsed donors or inactive donors or anything like that. Because as we'll see in these results, and I'll turn this over to Elizabeth in a second, many of your lapsed donors don't think of themselves as such. And if there's one thing that you take away from this data today, that's probably one of the most important things. Before I turn it over to Elizabeth here, I do want to say also, if you have questions during this session, feel free to write them into the chat. I will monitor that and we will respond as things come up, because I know we'll have some time for questions at the end, but at the same time, if there's something on a slide that's confusing you or some piece of data you want to ask about, it's often easier to do that right as we go. So please have no problem with interrupting via the chat if we can help clarify anything. And so let's go, next slide. So myths about lapsed donors. Now, when we say myths, I think everyone kind of assumes that you mean things that are untrue. And And some of these definitely have some truth behind them, but they might be a little bit differently interpreted than we would ordinarily think. So here are some attitudes that I run into in our consulting work about lapsed donors that are pretty common. One is that lapsed donors don't want to have a relationship with your organization anymore. They're voting with their wallet, as it were, and they're saying, please stop contacting me. I don't want to hear from you. Another is that their priorities have changed. You know, they're not interested in us anymore. They're doing other things. They're spending more time with their kids or their grandkids, and their life stage has changed, and those sorts of things. So, you know, both of these kind of amount to like, well, maybe there's not much we can do, or it might not be worth an investment in bringing on lapsed donors if those are the things that are causing them to stop giving. Another is that they're sick of hearing us. I'll hear people use this phrase, donor exhaustion, right? Like we think, gosh, we've been sending 10, 12 mailers a year to these people. They get our monthly e-newsletter. The higher level donors get calls from people on staff and they get asked to meet. They're probably just really sick of hearing from us. And that's very, even for the active donor side of things and the lapsed donor side of things, very rarely do I see actual evidence of that at most nonprofits, but it's a common attitude you hear. Aren't they sick of hearing from us? And then lastly, you know, they were never really interested in the cause to begin with. And this can be true in certain cases, you know, when you think of big crowdfunding campaigns where someone gives to a nonprofit because their friend is passionate about a nonprofit and they're just passionate about their friend, not necessarily the mission of the nonprofit. And so some nonprofits do have people on their former donor rolls who weren't very interested to begin with. But by and large, our survey data will show here that that's largely not the case. By and large, your lapsed donors are still interested in your mission. And so, yeah, we find most of these are not really true, particularly number 3, your lapsed donors, at least that answered the survey, are definitely still, they're receiving mailings, they're listening to, they're opening emails, they're interacting with you in other ways. They are still there for communicating with. And priorities have changed. We'll see there is some truth to that, but there's a lot of nuances into how the lapsed donors describe why it is their priorities change or how their priorities have changed.
So thank you, Matt, for sharing that background on the survey. As Matt said, he's monitoring the Q&A. So just a reminder that if you have any questions as we get into the more technical part of the conversation, that you're welcome to share your comments or questions. So Matt shared the background on why we had been talking about this for a while, and eventually we decided that it was time to do this lapsed donor survey, but we had to make it happen. So we reached out to several different organizations, and we ended up finding 10 different nonprofits that were willing to participate. So we asked these willing participants for their lapsed donor files. And in this case, we defined lapsed donor as anybody that had not given for at least 2 years. So their most recent gift was at least 24 months before the survey went out. So we reviewed these donor files from the nonprofits, and if there was anybody that maybe had given a gift 18 months ago, we excluded them from this survey. Also on this donor file, we had some giving history about these donors. So we were able to see maybe when their first gift was, and maybe how many gifts they had ever made to the organization. So that was a good information to have. And then we also were looking for emails because we planned to distribute this survey via an email. So before we distributed the survey, we ran an email append just to get as many contacts as we could. And then once that was ready, we picked a day and we sent out the emails with the survey link. And then in the end, we received 4,256 survey responses. And we found that this was a pretty reasonable number. We were happy with it. But definitely one question that you always have when running a survey is how well does this category or audience of respondents correspond to the actual whole of the lapsed donor base. So luckily we have those lapsed donor files from the organizations, and we were able to make some comparisons between those who responded and those did not. So just very quickly, we compared the years since the last gift. So the median in the responding group was 4 years. And among those lapsed donors who did not respond, their lapse time was 5 years. So this was pretty similar. And then looking at some other stats, so highest previous contribution, the median gift was the same for both groups. In all-time giving, the median gift was in the same range in the hundreds. And then the total gift count median also was 1 for both of these groups. So looking at comparing these numbers, we felt that the respondents seemed fairly representative of the whole, and we had some confidence in the results that we're going to share. So you may have already had a chance to look through some of these findings in the handout, but hopefully I'm going to provide a little bit more background and even more findings than what's on that PDF. So the first one, the main takeaway that Matt recommends you really remember after this talk is that many donors don't consider themselves lapsed. The question we asked the donors was, do you consider yourself a donor to this organization? And keep in mind that, as Matt mentioned, we made sure to use messaging of saying, thank you for your support. We'd love to have your feedback on this survey. And we didn't use the term lapsed donor at all. So we really wanted the donors to define themselves. So 49% still consider themselves a donor, even though they haven't made a gift for at least 2 years. And then only a third, about 34%, were the ones that had consciously made that decision to stop giving. And then there were the 16% that said they never considered themselves a donor. And we had a couple of theories for why this might have been. Maybe it was a single gift. The donor was testing out whether they wanted to become active in this organization. They decided not. Maybe so much time had passed that they really, truly did not remember the gift. Or maybe they had bought a ticket to an event or something else that they hadn't realized was a donation and put them on the list. But another reason why we might have seen this results is we also found that donors tended to underestimate how much time had passed since their last gift. And we were able to figure this out because we asked in the survey, how much time do you estimate has passed since your last gift? And then we also had those donor files from the organizations, so we could tell, so we knew how long the time had been. So in those lapsed donors who hadn't made a gift for 2 to 5 years in these first 2 rows, it was about 50% that said their last gift was sometime in the past year. And then going up to 6 to 9 years and 10 plus years, we're dropping down to more like a third, but still about a third of people think that their gift was sometime in the past year. And then this orange column is highlighted because this would have been the correct answer for these respondents to pick, because all of their gifts were over 2 years ago. But less than 50% at all levels got this correct.
Elizabeth, I'm just gonna step in here to answer a question from the chat that I think is a really good one. Somebody asked, did our sample of donors include memorial gifts? And the answer is yes, if the organizations had memorial gifts. We didn't ask any of the participating groups to exclude any particular category of giving. So much like I kind of mentioned that like peer-to-peer support, you know, memorial gifts are obviously a category of giving where you can see someone totally forget that they've donated. You can see someone say that they, you know, never cared about the mission or something like that. That's certainly a potential category that would show up a little bit differently in the data if we had that categorization to draw on. But we didn't ask the nonprofits for that information. So it would in theory include them, but we can't separate them out as a separate category. The only other thing I'll add to this slide as well is, we're assuming that the data is well managed, right? At these groups, it's possible that some of these people who say that they gave gifts more recently than 2 years did in fact actually do that, but maybe they gave using under a spouse's name who is recorded in a separate record, or through a foundation or a donor advised fund or something like that, in such a way that, depending on how the data was managed in the CRM, the donor could be right. We think that effect was fairly minimal overall. We think there is a real effect we're seeing here of donors just really underestimating the time since they have most recently donated. But there is potential for that, depending how the data is handled. And of course, we know, as people involved in database consulting, as Elizabeth is, no one's database is ever totally perfect on this account, right? So that, just wanted to mention that as a potential confounding factor as well.
Thank you, Matt. Those are all great points. And that was also a great question to bring up. That's right, we didn't ask about memorial gifts or either the donor or the organization at all in this survey. But in other studies I've seen or other analyses, memorial gifts certainly do make up a large portion of lapsed donors. So moving on to the next finding, we titled this one, "It's Not You, It's Me." And this was in response to the survey question, why did you stop giving to this organization? So first of all, this question was only posed to those donors that said they no longer consider themselves a donor. So those that still consider themselves a donor were not asked this question. And then secondly, those who consciously decided to stop giving, just based on a person's psychology, we find that often somebody wants to be able to point to an internal reason, something that they purposefully decided. It was a decision that they made, and so sometimes they might need to come up with a reason for why that happened. And we think that might have something to do with why a good portion of these responses, the red ones here, if you're able to see, are the more "it's me" reasons. But that doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily anything that a nonprofit or that your organization could do to retain these donors in the first place. So we actually see that the top reason that people gave for stopping to give is to prioritize giving to other nonprofits. So that doesn't necessarily mean they had a negative experience with you, but maybe they had a more positive experience elsewhere. And so that donor experience is something that can maybe be controlled to an extent and could be a way for you as an organization to proactively prevent donors from lapsing. So don't give them a reason to lapse, even though there are some of those negative experiences that are possible. Not a lot of people cite that as a reason for stopping giving. Instead, you can focus on meeting your donors where they are. So just looking at a couple of these "it's me" responses. So the first one is, "I would like to, but I cannot give at this time." A little bit, about 16% of people cited this as the reason they stopped giving. And it sounds like it could be a temporary lapse. But if that relationship was never there to begin with, then it could possibly turn into a permanent lapse. So if there was some kind of accountability that the organization was holding this donor to, and there was some kind of communication, maybe you could meet the donor where they're at and make sure that even though they can't give right now, they're still thinking about you and they can come back in the future. And then the next finding we have is "they're still listening, especially through the mail." So this one was in response to the question, how have you communicated with this organization in the past 2 years? And you will note that email is the top selected answer here, but we find that That's very likely because this survey was distributed via email. So a lot of these respondents are probably very active in using their email, or maybe anytime they see the name of the organization in the subject line, they like to click on it. But this survey was not distributed via mail. So we see that over 50% of these donors say they're still communicating via mail. So they're still listening. So probably the main takeaway here is don't take them off of your mailing lists just yet. Maybe change the messaging, but it looks like you have something to say, Matt.
Oh yeah, just another question from the chat here. Somebody asked, could respondents choose more than one answer for this question? And yes, both for on the previous slide, you could select up to 3 reasons that you stopped donating. And obviously here you could select as many as were the case for you.
Yes, to clarify on that point, the 3 options they could have selected were yes, I still communicate in this way, no, I do not communicate, or I have not and I would be interested. So each of these adds up to 100% because survey respondents were able to answer each of these questions separately, whether or not they communicate by email, whether or not by mail, and so on. And then somewhat related to both this point as well as the previous one, something we found was that 98% of the respondents who said they stopped giving because the organization asked for gifts too often had never made a gift larger than $500. So most of the people here were low to mid-level donors. This is coming from that question, why did you stop giving? So it was 6% said the organization asked for gifts too often. To begin with, this is very few people who are saying this is a problem. And then another way of looking at this is almost nobody over the $500 mark is saying that this is a problem. But this is demonstrating an imbalance that we often see, where for low and mid-dollar donors, it's easy for them to be overlooked and maybe not be acknowledged or thanked as often as they should be, maybe just because of some manpower limitations on the organization's end. But these donors are the lower and mid-level donors are possibly the ones that are most likely to think you ask for gifts too often because you don't acknowledge them in the same amount or frequency. The next finding we have is that the donors still believe in the cause. The lapsed donors still believe in the cause. The question we asked was, how important is this organization's mission to you? And over 3/4 of respondents picked the top choice, which was very important, number 5. And then another 18% said somewhat important. So together, the somewhat importance and the very importance made up 94% of respondents. So this is a lot of passion that is still left in these lapsed donors. And an interesting correlation we found, we're not exactly sure what the cause of this is, but we found that the donors that had a higher affinity also had been lapsed for less time. So the ones that selected not at all, I don't believe in this mission, their median lapse time was 11 years compared to those who were in the 94% saying they still really believe in this mission. Their median lapse time was 4 years. So we're not sure if it's maybe these donors have been left off mailing lists for so long that they have forgotten about the great work that you do, or maybe a long time ago they decided they were going to stop giving because their affinity was lower, and so it's been a long time and they haven't renewed. The next findings we'd like to share are based on CrossTabs, which are where we look at how different subsets of respondents responded or answered the same question. So in this case, we're looking at how responses to this question about planned giving differed based on the donor's highest previous contribution. And what we found is that there are planned giving prospects really at all levels. So maybe there's a tendency to look toward major donors first when thinking about planned giving prospects, but really at any level, there are people that have maybe already named nonprofits in their will. And then on the other side, thinking about those who have completely written off nonprofits, I do not plan to name any in my will or estate plan. That's less than 50% across the board. So there's a lot of potential in here. And I know this is something that Matt talks a lot about, so feel welcome to jump in if there's anything you'd like to say. The last point I'll just make is there were a good amount of donors that said they would like to give, but they cannot at this time. And so maybe they would be great planned giving prospects too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I would just add, you know, however you crunch the numbers on your donor base in terms of lifetime value, or you're looking at the percentage of revenue you get out of lower dollar donors, no matter how you do that in a standard way, it tends to make it look like your lower dollar donors are unimportant, right? Or less important than the major donors to your organization. And obviously there are ways in which that is true, but I think the importance here is that, first of all, we know that many of your lower dollar donors are the major donors of the future to your organization, number one. But what this data shows as well is that even in your lowest dollar donor categories, there are people who can leave you in their will and maybe have done so, maybe are interested in doing so. And though they may not do that even at as high a rates as $1,000 plus donors, there's an enormous opportunity there. And that's why sometimes you'll hear, this saying that planned giving is the major gift of the middle class, right? I might not be able to leave gifts that rise to the attention of the development staff or the leadership team at an organization, but my passionate giving over many years and the loyalty developed through that, if I continue to give, can lead to planned gifts that will be large for me as a middle class giver, and will be significant to the organization. If not, maybe the $10 million planned gift of a major donor, but 50,000, 100,000, $250,000, very, very good, significant gifts. And so that's just a reason to not underestimate the importance of losing high quantities of lower dollar donors and letting them lapse.
Also, in that vein, that reminded me, thinking about these percentages, there are certainly more under $100 donors than there are $2,500 plus donors. So this percent, although it's smaller, it does represent quite a few people.
More people, yep, represents way more people. That's right.
Next CrossTab finding that we'd like to share is giving begets giving. And this one we found interesting because it seems counterintuitive. So what the finding is that donors who had made more than one gift to an organization were likely to, or they had given to a greater count of nonprofits. So if I didn't completely butcher that, I hope you understand, but let me say that in different words. So just because maybe you hear that a donor is giving to other nonprofits, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would rule you out, because this finding seems to show that donors that like to give just have a propensity for giving, and so they may give to more people, maybe more gifts, more organizations, and why not yours? But because they're giving to a lot of these different organizations, coming back to the lapsing part, it might not hurt every once in a while to remind them of their last gift date to you, so that they'll know, okay, it's time to make another gift. And then our last crosstab finding we have here, higher dollar lapsed donors tend to begin giving due to a personal connection to the organization. This is one that we went back and forth a couple of times trying to figure out how to interpret this. And I think one of the trickiest parts was we're not exactly sure how this table and breakdown would compare to the active donor base. So this may be similar between both lapsed donors and active donors, but we're not exactly sure. But we still thought it was interesting that looking at the levels above $500, the top portion of these groups selected, I heard of this organization from a friend, and that's why I first started to give. So maybe this goes back to the memorial gifts a little bit. So maybe the donor lapsed because they made a generous one-time gift in memory of their friend who really liked this organization, but that was all they were planning to do. Maybe their friend was really talking it up, but they didn't have the same experience. Their friend oversold the organization, and they didn't have the same experience as their friend did. I'm not exactly sure why we're finding these numbers. But then on the flip side, oh yeah.
I was just going to say one of my theories here, and I'd like to do more active donor surveying so we can compare this, is that, you know, I think of, okay, if you have an annual gala, for example, right, and you have a board committee for the gala, and they're asking their friends to sponsor a table for $2,500 or $5,000 or more, and they might do that. But that type of person who's, you know, a friend of a donor is very likely to lapse, right? So it could be that if we surveyed active donors and compared this, we would find that high dollar donors who came in through the mail or something like that actually had much lower rates of lapsing, right? Or it could be, if it were similar, it would say something different. It would be saying that you know, referrals are a key way to get higher level donors who stick around. And obviously that's one strategy for getting higher level donors. The other thing I would point out, well, two things on this. One is that, again, attribution or agency bias, I would call it. Somebody who's giving $5,000, $10,000 to an organization, we see it all the time in the data. Oh, the first time they gave was in response to a mailing or something like that. But is that person going to want to attribute their now very long-standing high involvement with an organization to having received a random mailing back in the day? Probably not. So I suspect as well, there's more bias towards that answer, the higher up the giving level you go. But the other thing I want to point out here, and this is borne out by many other pieces of data we've seen, not only internally, but from other organizations in the past, is that people who start as online donors renew at much lower rates than people who came in through mail or other means. And so you kind of see that here. They give lower average gifts usually, and they lapse at higher rates. And so you see that really high number in the under $100 donors. And that's not surprising to me that online donors would lapse at a really high rate.
Right, so thinking about the 100% again, so the under $100 donors were asked to select which of these was the first way that they heard about this organization, and the top answer there was for $100 donors, I heard of this organization online. For the 100 to 500 category, that was I heard of this organization from the mail, and then the top ones, I heard of this organization from a friend. So it's an interesting pattern. And at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation back to Matt, and he's going to share about some of the practical ways that you can apply this knowledge to your strategies for the coming year.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that run through the data. Just to leave you with some practical tips here, and then we'll have time for questions if there are any others. You know, what do we do with this data, right? One of our philosophies in American Philanthropic is collecting data, looking at data is very nice, but it has to be correctly interpreted, and then you have to do something with it, right? You have to put in place practices that reflect what the data has told you. Otherwise, you were wasting your time. So just to leave you with some practical ideas here, we can mention this before, don't treat the donors as lapsed, you know, explicitly in a verbal way, because half of them don't think that they are lapsed. They think that they're still involved. So you'll sometimes see communications that are very aggressive about using that language. your membership will expire if you do not reply by March 31st, and those sorts of things. And that we find is not an ideal way to go about these things. Now, that said, because you noticed in the data that many of the lapsed donors were simply wrong about when their last gift had been, and they tended to attribute it, much more recently than it had been, we do think that that means there's a good reason to softly talk about when their last gift was and when that was and how they can continue to support the organization. So we've seen some success this year. For example, some of our colleagues have done tax receipt mailings, as they would normally do in January and February, saying, here was all your giving in 2021. If you need this as a tax receipt, you can use it. It's a good excuse to have a nice soft cultivation piece of mail. But we had some clients who did this and sent it to lapsed donors, saying, you didn't give anything in 2021, right? Thank you for your support over the years. You did not make any contributions we have on record in 2021. So if you'd like to continue your support, here's how you can do that. It was not super aggressive red letters, everything's expiring, but it caused people to call in. Some people even apologize, like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize I didn't give in 2021. So it's about striking a balance there, like reminding them of the status of their giving in a softer way, in a more polite way, and not going into the territory of like total guilt, that you'll sometimes see an email or a piece of mail try to do for an organization. So then another thing we want to do, right, is we want to be meeting the donors where they are and entering into relationships, or trying to regenerate relationships in this case, in a way that reflects their own understanding about their giving, which as staff members in nonprofits is very hard to do mentally in some cases. It's okay, for example, to ask for a lower gift amount from lapsed donors. It wasn't a huge answer in that chart, but it does say, there is a portion of your donor base who's stopping their giving because of more limited means, or their budget for giving is fixed and they're prioritizing other groups. And so it is okay, in particular if you can segment that based on survey results, right? If you go survey all of your lapsed donors and you find a core of people who are saying that their financial situation has changed, that they prioritize other groups, you can ask for a reactivation gift that is lower than what their highest previous contribution might have been, which is normally that number we key on when we're putting together and merging ask amounts in a mailing or an email campaign. Obviously, you want it to be really personal. You want it to be addressed to them and their situation as much as possible. And very much in the messaging, what we find works with lapsed donors is to go very much back to the basics. What is my mission? Why am I here? What does it mean to be a supporter of, this whole organization, this whole cause, not just, one program that you might feature to your regular donors in a particular mailing. Go back to basics. And that's why oftentimes inserting the lapsed donor list into your prospecting mailing or prospecting emails tends to work pretty well, because those prospecting communications, when your staff or someone is sitting down to write those and craft that messaging, it's always starting with the basics, right? Because you're trying to bring people initially into the life of your organization. And so if you can treat people with that language, you'll have a greater chance of bringing them back on board. So tip number 3 here, again, the data shows that by and large, they're still listening. And so depending on how your donor database looks in terms of how many lapsed donors do you have, at 3, 4, 5+ years after their giving, oftentimes there's a tendency to say, "Ooh, I can cut down my mailing budget, right? If I take out some of the really lapsed donors that don't respond at very high rates." And there's not one particular right answer here that is correct for every single nonprofit in every single situation, but these findings really pushed me on this question of, well, how long should I leave someone in my active donor file? Typically, we tend to define, as we did here, in setting up this survey, someone's lapsed 2 years after their most recent gift. But I think there's a very strong argument in here for keeping the lapsed donors on the list at least through 36 months, maybe 48 months, so that they have a chance to reactivate. And the important thing about that is to read the data on lapsed donor response rates and gifts when you're done with a mailing and compare it mentally to your prospecting efforts, not to your normal house file current donor mail, right? So obviously your 3 and 4 year lapsed donors are going to respond at lower rates. It's going to raise lower revenue than your active donor file. But I'm going to say 90% of the time, you're going to find that it's more cost effective than doing pure prospecting activity, right? And so considering keeping those donors on for a longer period of time is definitely something I would do. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be every single mailing. If you put out, 8 solicitations a year and 4 pieces of cultivation mailing, does a 48-month lapsed donor need to be on every single one of those? Maybe not. Maybe they can be on a more limited track 2, 3, 4 times a year. You include all those lapsed donors, particularly at the end of year campaign. That should usually be your widest reach within your funnel of donors. And then we also think it's important to be tracking information on non-donation activity, right? Because somebody who stops donating but continues to be involved in other ways, they may be a really good planned giving prospect, and they're certainly much more likely to come back on as a donor. So if I have a limited budget for reaching out to lapsed donors, the first people I'm going to want to communicate with are people who are still volunteering maybe, or they're still coming to events, or even they have a really high email open rate. We know they're still reading what comes across their desk from your organization. Those are very important signifiers for a greater inclination to come back and be part of your organization, or to even still consider themselves part of the organization, to view themselves as one of those, I am a donor, I have not lapsed, I have not made that decision. Especially we like a focus on mid-dollar donors because that's often an ignored category. If you're an organization that has thousands and thousands of lapsed donors, at the 3, 4, 5 year mark, and you just can't, I just can't put them in my mail budget for the entire year, that would double what I have to spend on that. We find often in the data with lapsed donors, whether they're done in prospecting mailings as part of the house file, that people at the $100 plus range are much more likely to reactivate in general. And obviously they give higher average gifts than the lower dollar donors when they do. So those are often segments that you can include in your communication moves that will perform highly, even though they've lapsed. 3, 4, 5 year lapsed donors, but at that $100, $250 plus level are often great to include. Another thing we think is important, right, is timely communications. So obviously when we get towards the end of year campaign, everyone starts thinking about their live bunt donors, their last year but not this year donors, and getting in front of them and trying to reactivate them while hopefully their memories of the organization are still fresh, still positive. And that is important. Oftentimes, 9 months after a first gift in particular is kind of a critical mark we see for keeping people from slipping into that lapsed donor category. If we can get a second gift within 9 months, we know that bodes very well in terms of their retention rate after that. But be timely. There's some famous studies recently, I'm going to forget who to attribute these to, but some studies on thank yous where organizations have studied in mass, do thank yous matter? Do thank you phone calls in particular matter? And there's one of these big studies that basically concluded, no. When we made thank you calls to half of our donors and we didn't make them to half, there was no difference at the end of the day, whether we made thank you calls. And when you dig into the data, what I found though, was that the thank you calls weren't happening right after the gift, right? They were happening through sort of a mass telethon effort that was maybe 4 or 6 months after the gift had occurred. And so to me, what the study was really showing was not don't thank your donors or don't call your donors and thank them. It was showing thanking them in a way that shows that it's not actually tied to their gift, right? It wasn't an activity generated by the gift. You were just going through and calling 1,000 donors and thanking them at a time that was convenient for you. Doesn't have the same effect as a phone call you get within 72 hours of the gift receipt, right? Because when I get that call, I know someone's responding to my timeline and my contribution in particular, and it's not just a mass effort. So that timeliness is very important. So then planned giving. We talked about the planned giving opportunity. It might seem strange to many people to be soliciting planned gifts from lapsed donors or talking about planned giving with lapsed donors, because normally we think of the best planned giving prospects as the people who are most loyal to you, right? And that those are the best planned giving prospects. But because again, there is this segment of people who feel still very much attached to your mission. They either still consider themselves a donor or they attribute their reason to stopping donating to some financial change in the situation of theirs. There's actually good reasons to include planned giving messaging with lapsed donors. Another benefit of that, I think, is that even for people who are not and will not ever consider making a planned gift to your organization, we find that organizations who talk about planned giving to their donor base, it actually helps the rest of your giving as well. And that's because talking about planned giving sends this implicit message to your donors that you have a long-term vision. You're going to be around in 20 or 30 years. You have a long-term plan. You're on solid financial footing. Planned giving kind of communicates all those things, even if you're talking to someone who's not going to leave you a planned gift. And that can be important for lapsed donors as well. So, I wouldn't go drop a bunch of money on a pure planned giving solicitation to all of your lapsed donors or anything like that. But particularly for those who have other non-donation activity, or they've answered a survey and told you they're still interested and involved, that can be a segment to include in your planned giving outreach that you have planned for the year. So yeah, target lapsed donors who've made multiple gifts first. Of course, we know that if you've made second gift, third gift, fourth gift to the organization, you're going to be much more likely to come back on board and be willing to reactivate. So that's another segment. If you're talking about, again, I've got a limited budget for some of this lapsed donor outreach, segmenting out your single gift lapsed donors is often a good way to target in a more defined way people who are more likely to respond positively. So then personalizing donor interactions, right? If your high dollar donors, as we saw, are more likely to be coming in through a personal connection, if you have recorded, right, the data on that personal connection, which oftentimes is the case for memorial gift and maybe through some of the peer-to-peer campaigns that you might be running, if you can have that friend be part of a resolicitation or a reactivation campaign in some way, even if it's just using their name merged into a mailing and an email campaign, that can be very helpful to remind them why they came on board in the first place. Or even in the case of a memorial gift, if there's something you can say about the importance of that of your mission to that friend or relative of theirs. And again, don't forget, people are still listening, they're still getting your emails, they're still receiving mailings. So yeah, just to summarize what we've covered here, many donors don't consider themselves lapsed. They tend to attribute causes for lapsing to themselves, not to things that you've done. They are still listening. They still believe in the cause. They may include great planned giving prospects. It's good to focus on those multi-gift donors for reactivation. And again, high-level dollar donors tend to be people who came in through a more personal connection. And so I know our time is coming to a close here. If there are any other questions, people can feel to chime in or write into the chat. I know someone inquired a couple of people inquired about the PDF document that we shared. Feel free to reach out to us by email if you have any further questions on that. We don't have a full CrossTabs version that we're sharing with everyone. As much as hopefully some of you are data nerds who would love to have like the 90-page breakdown of those things, we can send you a copy of this presentation today with some of those key findings. But the last thing I'll say about that too is these findings are really what jumped out to us. I think there's a tendency to think, and we explored in the data whether there are, high-level donors, for example, behave very, very differently from low-level donors or answer questions very differently. And by and large, a lot of the CrossTabs didn't come to that conclusion. There was a lot more uniformity than I had expected. But again, our email addresses are here. We'd love to hear from you. And then in the chat, I know one of our colleagues is putting in a couple of other webinar and event opportunities that are coming up if you'd like to learn more about other topics. But thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to hear from some of you if you have further questions. Thanks.